What's up, everybody? It's great to see you at this event. Let me change my camera a little bit. Maybe that's a little better. I don't know. How's everybody's local hack day going so far today or tonight? Whatever it is for you in your time zone. Hi, Abhijit. How are you? I hope I'm pronouncing it. Everyone's names right. It's kind of difficult over the internet to know how to pronounce some names for me, but you can always let me know if I'm doing it wrong. But hi, Takshak. Nice to meet you virtually. Let's see. Let's see. What have I done today so far? So I did get to check in on Anuya's fintech workshop, which I thought was really cool. She even talked a little bit about personal finance, which I think is really interesting. Let me turn off my phone notifications here so we don't get interrupted while we're on the stream. So where is everybody logging on from? I always find it curious just to see, because people really come from all over the world to these events, which is pretty incredible. Abhijit says, I got up at 4:30 a.m. in India. That is incredible. So that's pretty good. I mean, you get a little early start to your day. And I actually got an early start to my day because I thought I was going to run this workshop a little earlier. But it turned out to work out great because, you get some stuff done in the mornings. Nobody's up. You know what I mean? You can kind of do whatever you want. It's a quiet time. But we really appreciate you coming to the events. It's definitely dedication to come at such an early time like that. It's like our numbers are growing a little bit. Welcome to all the newcomers to our stream. It's really great to see you here. Yeah, I think people pretty much come from all over the world to these. I'm actually here in Los Angeles, California, and it's not such a bad hour right now. It's 4 p.m. Sun is still out. It's actually kind of cold here compared to the temperature it usually is. It's not quite. I don't think it really snows here. I actually just recently moved here. So I don't really think it ever snows here to my knowledge, but it is a little cold. Enthusiasm drove me here. I like to hear that. That's awesome. Yeah, well, we are going to talk a lot today about some pretty interesting topics. At least they're interesting to me, and hopefully I can make them interesting to you. If anyone wants to chat in the chat about if they've ever used Flask before, or they've heard of Flask, or they've heard of Python. I feel like a lot of people have heard of Python, maybe more than have heard of Flask, but really they're almost one and the same. Like Flask is an extension of Python, and it really helps streamline some development goals in Python. And probably the biggest development goal that Flask can help you streamline is building web applications. Let me see if I think I have this here on my computer. Let's see here. Fellowship. stuff. So if any of you are at all interested in our fellowship, let me share that, because I think it's actually kind of relevant here. So a couple people are responding. So I use Python, but just a bit of Flask. That's great. That's kind of exactly where this is targeted to. It's like folks who might know some Python, but aren't as familiar with Flask. And Django is another technology that performs similar function to Flask. So it's good that you have some experience in that. That's awesome. Let me show you my screen real quick. Hopefully this works out okay. Let's see how that worked out. Yeah, that worked out well. So this is actually something, some slides from an earlier presentation that I gave at Local Hack Day. You can see in the bottom right corner, this is a link to applying to the fellowship. If any of you are interested in our fellowship, which is kind of like a mixture, I would say, between doing an internship and learning in an educational curriculum. It's, I'll just put the link in the chat. It actually requires you to have a code sample. And there are some requirements for this code sample. And if you notice, one of the requirements for your code sample, it says not too large. It's difficult to have a conversation about a mono repo with dozens of microservices. It should be immediately clear what you contributed to the sample. Dense frameworks with lots of boilerplate, such as Django or Laravel, don't usually make for good samples. Lightweight frameworks such as Flask and Express are good examples. So based on this kind of guidance from the fellowship, Flask can actually be a really good technology to try out for the purposes of submitting a code sample for your fellowship application. It's kind of easy to read a Flask project because it is so lightweight. It's technically called what's called a microservice, which means you can I think what I mean to say is a micro framework. Let's Google that real quick. Yeah, I mean to say a micro framework. So it kind of operates within Python. It doesn't require external dependencies outside of Python, which is pretty cool, I would say. Makes it really simple to get going with it. But even so, it can be kind of complicated to get started with Flask, which is what we're going to do today. We're going to kind of talk about getting started with Flask and what you can do to make your project look really streamlined and functional. All right, let me see if I can paste in our check-in link here, get some folks checked in. Just dropped a link for the check-in. So go ahead and click over there to log in. If you haven't already, it's just good for us to keep track. And also you can get some points for your guild, and always good to get those extra points. Okay, I'm gonna take this off of there. It looks like we are actually at 7 p.m. Eastern. So maybe we'll get started now with our main programming, which is programming. We're gonna build a Flask app. And I did ask already those folks who maybe have used Flask in the past or used Python in the past to send in a chat. Let me know what they've worked on in the past. But really, whether you're a beginner or somewhat more advanced, hopefully this workshop will be helpful to you. We're really going to go through the basics of Flask and what it's doing on a functional level so that you can understand the basic building blocks. There's a lot of tutorials online, I think, for advanced concepts in Flask and how to actually like implement all of these cool things. I actually have my own tutorial on Flask that I wrote for Major League Hacking a little while ago, and it's more of an advanced project than what we're going to cover today. I'll put a link to that in the chat before, as soon as we're done with today's tutorial. But for today, we're going to cover some of the basics, like a core concepts. So what I want you to do first, before we go any further, is log in on replit.com or whatever service you use to edit your code. I'm going to be using Replit today because it's pretty convenient for what we are going to be doing today. But you're welcome to use whatever kind of concept or technology you want to use to compile your code. Okay, so hopefully you can see that screen there. I'm actually going to zoom in a little bit. It seems kind of like we could benefit from some zooming action. Replit Game Jam, that seems kind of interesting. Build a game on Replit. Maybe you could build a game using Flask. That's kind of cool. So actually on replit.com, it's pretty easy to make your own account. You just need to have like email or Facebook or Google account and you're ready to go, which is why I like it a lot for our purposes. And you'll actually want to click this Create REPL button in the top left. That's going to let you build your project from scratch. And you'll notice that it has a title and also that it's public. So if you want, you can try and follow along with my example here. This is kind of a weird name, so I'm going to change it to LHD example. LHD example. And it's going to be a Python project. You can see I kind of just quickly did that. I didn't even really explain what I did there, but the default project on REPL is node.js file, which is a JavaScript framework. So we want to change to Python framework because, like I said earlier, Flask is a micro framework that kind of almost lies within Python. All of the dependencies at least lie within it. Okay, so let's click Create REPL now. And here we are in our REPL. So I'm actually gonna maybe try and, how do I want to do this? I think I'm going to try to share the actual Chrome window instead of the Chrome tab, because we're going to actually want to switch between two tabs. So I'm going to try that now. Let's see if I can figure that out. All right, this should do it. Now you can kind of see what's going on with our window. So now we have two windows. One is going to be like for how we can see our Flask project, and one is going to be our Replit, which is going to show us the code, the underlying code. So the first thing we're going to do in our project in this main.py file, this is a Python file, is we're going to actually import Flask. So it's really easy to import Flask into Python. You just write import Flask. Pretty much just plain English there. And we have Adam, legendary Adam from Blahaj Gang, joining us on the stream, from the chat. Hope things are going well with you, Adam. I actually hope that things are going well with everybody on the stream. If you want to say hello, feel free to send a chat. how's everybody feeling about this, this Replit stuff, or even just getting set up with whatever code editor you want to use? I think Replit is a really good way to get started because kind of all of the stuff you need to deploy the Flask project is already built in, and we don't have to spend time figuring out how to install all this stuff and configure it properly. But if you want any help with Replit stuff, let me know. Okay, so like I said, import Flask is really the first thing we need to do. It's going to import all of the necessary functions, objects, methods that we need to build our web app. And a lot of people will do something like this, where they go from Flask, import Flask. And that's actually not at all incorrect. It's totally legitimate and correct to do things this way. But personally, I think that when we're first learning how to use a new package, it's better to just import Flask and then use the methods that come from and the objects that originate from that package, kind of secondary, so we can actually remember where all of these methods and objects are coming from. So I'm just going to import Flask on line 1. Okay, so on line 2, we want to, I'm actually going to leave a break here so it's a little more readable. On this next line, we are going to create a variable called app. And this is really going to be where we store our website. It's all going to kind of lie in this app variable. And we're going to instantiate this variable, and it's going to be a Flask object. So there is this object in the Flask package called Flask, which is kind of confusing, but the lowercase f is referring to the Flask package itself, and the uppercase Flask with an uppercase F is the Flask object, which is kind of like showing you the actual website. So this website object needs to originate from somewhere, and we're going to need to point it to a particular directory. And the way we do that is by using the name dunder variable. And I just kind of spoke a bunch of nonsense words. I said the name dunder variable. A dunder variable is kind of like this double underscore, kind of like keyword. And it's going to tell the Python file that we're interested in making the Flask object originate from main.py. So that's what that argument is doing when we pass it into the Flask object. Okay. So hopefully that's kind of clear to you all. I'll put a comment up here. So here we're importing the Flask package. And in this case, we are kind of instantiating a Flask website object. Is almost like what we're doing. It originates from name. Okay. Hopefully that's pretty clear to you all, what we've done so far. And embedded in this Flask object is a lot of functionality that would be kind of hard for us to program on our own, which is why it's so great to kind of be able to just create this Flask object. Okay, so there's a few more lines that we need to write before we have our website up and running. We need to use in the next line a function. So let's define a main function. And this is really just going to be kind of where we're going to store the contents of, or kind of all the infrastructure we're going to use to build this website. And this function is going to return a value. So let's make it return a string value called hello world. Okay? So this function is returning hello world string. And if you remember from what I was talking about earlier, where this app variable is where our website is, we kind of want to feed in whatever we're returning from this function to our website. And that's going to really be the kind of the bread and butter of Flask. So to do that, we're going to use something called a decorator, which is a code kind of a coding technology, kind of like a shorthand for adding extra functionality to a function. So as it stands right now, the main function only really returns a string, but we actually want to put that string onto our website. And that's what we're going to use this decorator for. And so we use an @ symbol to write any decorators, and it always has to come before our function. So in this case of this decorator, we are going to apply it to the app website, and we use the route method. And you can see in Replit, it's actually giving me a lot of cool information here. It's telling me that like this route, function is going to apply to this Flask object called app. And what it's doing is it's routing to the website. And we want to give it an address to route to. The most common website address to route to is just a standard /, a /. And what that does is it brings you to the main directory of the website. So let's look at an example here. So like we could do google.com/, and that's going to basically just bring us to Google's homepage. And similarly, when we route our app to /, that's going to kind of, actually, I don't know if that's a /. Is that a / or a \? If anybody in the comments knows, let me know. But whatever, our little / is going to route this hello world string to our main website. Okay, Adam says it is a /. All right, I believe you. Hopefully you're not just messing with me. Oh, this is how you can tell. Is it leaning forwards or backwards? Okay, I guess it is leaning forwards. So yeah, thank you. That's a good tip. So how do folks feel about this? The ideas we've introduced so far. I mean, we've introduced a lot of complex ideas, and we've only written about, let's see, 5 lines of code, 5 lines of real, honest code. We've covered a lot of concepts. The first concept we covered was importing a package, which has a lot of, there's a lot to that, where you're basically importing all of these different objects and methods and everything from this micro framework we call Flask. And then we instantiated a Flask website object, which is called Flask with a capital F. And that kind of built this huge, website that we can do a ton of stuff with. Then we wrote a function called main, which is going to kind of tell us what content to display on the website. And we routed that content to a specific directory in the Flask web app using a route decorator to kind of boost, level up our function, give it some extra content. We have some import blahaj from sharks. Yes. I think that probably will trigger an error if we do that. See, it doesn't know. Maybe we should actually run some kind of project where we do an open source blahaj package, or maybe a sharks package for Python, and we can do some blahaj objects. That would be kind of a fun hackathon project, don't you think? Yeah, and replace sharks with MLH. We can make a big MLH Python package, a bunch of lodges everywhere. Okay, so good. I think people haven't really given me too many questions, so I'm glad that you're following along. That's all really good. Let's actually try and look at our website now, because we've built a lot of functionality so far. There's a lot of richness in just the 5 lines that we coded. So let's try and use a run method, which is going to actually run our application. So to do that, it's something that requires 1 line of code. We're going to use the run method on our app Flask object. And run takes some parameters, and actually it even tells you here in REPL, which I think is super cool, all of these different parameters that are accepted by run. So for example, we need to specify a host, and it tells us that we just got to set it to 000. So let's do that right now. I think that's just how Replit understands where to host. It's going to host the website on Replit. So it probably just wants us to use that. But if you're on your home computer, you might want to use a localhost IP address for your home system. And we also need to put in a port. So I'll use 5000, which is that localhost port. And I'm going to optionally add another keyword argument into this function. I'm going to add the debug keyword, and I'm going to say true. Now, what this debug keyword is going to do is when we run our website, we kind of launch it up into the internet. When there's an error with our Flask object, or with our Flask code, it's going to print out an error message on the website. So that's why I like the debug keyword for development purposes. And so I enabled that. But you don't necessarily have to enable debug if you don't want to. Okay, so we kind of, at this point, have all of the necessary components for our website. It actually takes you can probably do it in less lines, but to follow standard readability, it is possible to do a Flask web app in a minimum of 6 lines, following kind of standard readability guidelines. So let's go ahead and run this code and see if it actually works for us. You can see in the terminal, there's a lot of different things Replit is doing for us. It's kind of trying to update and resolve all these dependencies. While it's doing that, I'm actually going to add some more comments. So for example, this routing decorator, this is a routing decorator that sends the result of the function. It sends it to our web app. Oops. Our web app. So that's one thing that's going on there. And while I was typing, it seems like we actually got a little bit messed up because my cursor got moved into the command line. So I reran it just now. And you can see that on the web address, https://lhdexample.croppers, which is my Replit username, .repl.co. On that address, we now see the text hello world. So I actually want to open this up in a new tab, which I can do using the open in a new tab button here in the top right corner of Replit. When I do that, it actually takes me to this website, LHD example. And actually, any of you can go to this website too if you wanted. But you will have your own as well if you're using Replit. And you can see it says hello world here. I could even inspect the element here, which is kind of showing me the code. And there's a lot of extra stuff here, but Okay, actually, this is not very clear. I'm going to ignore the inspect element stuff because I think it's a little too much unnecessary extraneous information. But hello world is the basic contents of this website. And that's exactly what we would expect from our string. We can also print out hello local hack day. And if we do that, it automatically regenerates the website. And if I refresh this page, now it says hello LHD. Okay, it's actually really hard for you all to read, I just realized, but hello Blahaj. Yeah, we could do hello Blahaj. But of course, it has to be capital Blahaj. And bingo, bango, bongo. Hello Blahaj. Okay, so we've kind of built our first Flask website all together now. And you should kind of give yourself a pat on the back for, getting this far. You've built your first Flask project. It's kind of a fundamental project, but it is actually generating a website using Python, which is kind of incredible if you think about it, in just 6 lines and 20 minutes of learning. Okay, so now that we've gotten through this first basic portion of Flask, we're going to add some additional functionality. We're going to kind of explore some of the different things that Flask is able to do. And we're going to do that by adding new directories to route to. So, or we can call these endpoints. So this is just the main endpoint where basically we're taking you to lhdexample.cropper.s.repl.co/, and that's it. But let's add a new function here. So let's give it a comment. And this one is going to actually be a redirect. So let's say this function redirects the user to google.com. Okay. So my goal in this next function is to actually create an endpoint on my website that when the user goes to that endpoint, the user gets redirected to Google. Okay, so let's try that. We need a decorator, just like we needed for the first function, because we're going to route our function to a specific endpoint in our website. And let's call this endpoint Google. Okay, because like I said, we're going to actually redirect the user to Google. Hello, everyone. Got some nice icons and folks coming in to the chat. Really good to see you all here coding with us, learning about Flask. If you're just joining, I'm not sure necessarily if either of you are just joining, but I think maybe some people might be just joining. What we're doing now is programming a website using Python. And it's really a lot simpler to program a website in Python, and a web app in particular, if you're using this micro framework called Flask. So that's what we're working on right now. We're actually creating a new endpoint on our website, which is going to be our web address /Google, and that's going to redirect the user to google.com. So, okay, now we have our decorator, but we need to build a function to decorate it with. So let's write a new function in Python. Should we just write def Google? And we're not going to really take any arguments, just like we didn't take any for the main function. Someone says, has a question actually. What are the package files on the Explorer? That's a great question. So let's actually look at those. These are files that are not super relevant to Flask, but they are important. So I'm kind of glad that you mentioned them. What these files do is create some metadata about our project that Replit automatically generates. It's like, for example, it's telling us about the name of this project and the version, some of the authors. You could even put your name here. we wanted to. It wouldn't make the code fail if you did that. You could even add a description. These are just basically package files. And this here is telling us a lot of dependencies that are kind of installed through this package manager. And it's telling us what are the things that Flask needs or that our project needs to run. So like Jinja 2, for example, is some sort of, it's part of the infrastructure of Flask that helps us build templates, which we're going to get into today. We're going to get into templating. A lot of this stuff is things that you don't really need to worry about for the purposes of Flask, but it is kind of interesting to look at all these automatically generated packager files that are helping run our Flask app in the background. Yeah, so that's a really good question. Thank you for bringing that up. So anyway, we're still working on our redirect function, and we built a decorator, which is going to tell Flask to route the result of this function onto our Google endpoint in our website. And now we're building the function itself that's going to do this redirect. So we call it Google function. And to do a redirect, all we need to do is return. And we're going to return a Flask method called flask.redirect. Okay. So this is just basically Flask's way of doing a redirection. And the main parameter that we need for this function is called location. So we just are going to basically specify a location to get redirected to. So let's specify google.com. And I just put the HTTPS here so that it'll go to google.com over the web. Okay, so let's now try and run this code. And we say hello Blahaj on the first page. So that's just like last time. But we added new functionality to our website. So when we type this web address and then we do /Google and hit enter. Oh, okay. Well, this is kind of interesting. I think Chrome is. I'm going to just click visit this unsafe site because I obviously know that this is not unsafe. But when I allow it to navigate to that endpoint, it redirects to google.com. So that's pretty cool. Yeah. Dang, now it says dangerous. I hope maybe I don't know, maybe they're saying sharks are dangerous or something. They noticed Blahaj. Anyway, so there's the redirect function. So we've just added a new capability to our website called the redirect. Let's try adding templates now. So templates is kind of the next level of Flask. If you're comfortable with writing a string and having the string get returned to your website, the next part is to write like an HTML code and have that get sent to the website. Because, HTML, which is also known as hypertext markup language, is the kind of way that websites are displayed for most cases. So we're going to work on a little bit of HTML. And if you don't know HTML super well, that's okay. We won't be getting too into the weeds with HTML. You can actually build like video games using HTML5, but we're not going to get so advanced. So let's get started with that. The way that we're going to do this is by adding a new decorator. So let's build a new line. And we're going to route this next function to the template endpoint. Okay, so this new decorator is going to send whatever result that we get from this function that we're about to build to the template endpoint on our website. And so let's write that function down. We'll write def template. And once again, we're not going to take any arguments into our function, but we will in the next example. But I do want to put in some kind of template here. So let's use the return value. And we're going to use another Flask function. So last time we used flask.redirect. This time we're going to use flask.render template, okay? So we're using the Flask function render template. And this function can take several arguments, or there are several parameters basically. And the first one is the template name, which we actually don't have one yet. So the template is going to be for us an HTML file. So let's call it template.html. Of course, remember this file doesn't actually exist yet. We're going to build this file. I just wanted to write it here as a placeholder so that you remember what to do. And let's try running this function, this code actually. Let's see what happens. So we still do get our code to run, but let's try navigating to that template endpoint. You can see that we get a exception. This is because we did enable debugging on our run. So on our run statement. So we're told that it's a template not found exception. And that kind of means that we need to tell Flask where to look for our template. So to do that, we're going to create a new folder. And it's going to kind of branch off of this main.py. And that folder is going to be called templates. And it's where we're going to store all of our template files. And we can add a file to this directory, and we'll call it template.html. Okay. So now we have an HTML file, which will serve as the basis for our template. And I'm going to actually type in this same statement that we typed in originally, which is hello world. Actually, let's type in hello template so that we don't get lost in the sauce. And I'm going to save. And let's restart our website. So now when I go to this endpoint, it says hello template, which is pretty cool, right? And so this is our hello template. We can also add in HTML tags. So in the HTML, in that language, there are things called tags. And one of the tags is H1. So whenever you type brackets around an H1 and you use a / to end that statement, whatever appears in between those two tags is going to render as a header. So let's actually see what happens now. You can see that hello template now looks a lot bigger. And we can also add in a paragraph. So we'll say this is a paragraph. And now when we refresh our page, we can get a paragraph. Yeah, we can really put in anything we want. We could even put in some kind of list object. So what I'm typing now is a little bit more advanced, but let's say this is like a shopping list. So we're going to put in different elements. We call UL stands for unordered list. And then these LI tags are going to be list items. So we can add some list items to our shopping list. I don't know why we're getting gravy, flour, and eggs. It's kind of a strange shopping list, but just go for it, I guess. So see, we've built this template, and now whenever we update that template, it updates our endpoint, which is pretty cool. Okay, so that's really great. And actually, there's more we can do with this template than just print out unchanging information. We can actually use the template to print out something that is dynamic, meaning that it can change over time or in response to things that are going on in Python. So let's actually try and do that. I'm going to go back to main.py, and I'm going to actually use this template function, but I'm going to add some additional lines into this function. I'm going to define a variable called x, and I'm going to set it equal to 5, the number 5. And you can tell there's a green line underneath this because you can see Replit is saying, hey, you assigned this variable, but you never used it. Why the heck did you do that? Well, let's pass it into our template function, our render template. We can actually put into this render template function as many variables as we want, not just one, but let's just put in one for now. So we'll call this new variable x. We'll set it equal to x, which is coming from this variable, which is local to the template function. And now it's going to get sent into this render template. You might be thinking, well, how are we going to figure out what x is on the other end in HTML? I'm sorry, I didn't mean to add a comment there. Well, let's go back to our HTML file, and we can add in some code for our input variable. So, or for this x. So let's add a new paragraph underneath our shopping list. And we're going to say that the test variable passed from Python is, and in Flask, we can kind of represent this variable using two curly braces on either side of it. So on either side of x, we now put some curly braces. The spaces that I added to that are just for readability purposes. Move it over a little bit. And now when we go to refresh this page, we see that the test variable passed from Python is 5, which is pretty cool. It means that we basically took something that existed only in Python, and we actually kind of almost ported it into our HTML5 document. And now it's getting rendered on our website, which is super cool. Yeah, so that's kind of like a really groundbreaking result that we can get from Flask that would take a really long time to program on your own. So I'm going to stop here actually for a minute and see if anybody has any questions about what we've done so far. Try and think of any questions you might have about what we've been going through so far, and whether you're having any problems getting this to work, or you're confused about what Flask is actually doing. No questions? Oh, we have some questions from Abhijit, which is better, Flask or Django? I think there's no real concrete answer to that question. I think it's mostly just based on what you prefer to use. There are certainly differences in the two platforms, especially at more advanced levels. I mean, what we're doing right now, you can kind of do in Django too, but it does end up being a larger project. I mean, larger like in terms of the files and the lines that you use. You're not going to be able to just write all of the rich functionality that we've built already in our app with just a couple of lines of code. It's going to be a little bit more extensive. But I think it just comes down to whatever you're more comfortable with. And for me, that's Flask. I personally am much more comfortable with Flask. I would recommend picking one that you feel like is working for you and then getting really in depth with that technology. If you're interested in these types of things, like if you're interested in building web apps. I will say that I think I already mentioned this before we started at 7 p.m. Eastern, in the kind of couple minutes before we started, that if you are happening to apply to the MLH Fellowship, there is even some explicit guidance on our webpage, which says that we would we consider Flask projects to be a pretty good, in general, a good platform to write a code sample on, because it is lightweight and it's easy to read for whoever's going to review your project. So that's definitely something. Adam says, wait, do you not work in Blahaj gang time? I honestly have no idea what time zone that is. If you can tell me what time it is right now in Blahaj time, is that like Swedish time? It's Antarctica time. Okay, well, I didn't even know there was such a thing as Antarctica time. It's news to me. That's awesome. Okay. All right. Well, we should probably get back to our programming, because it seems like not a lot of folks have questions so far about Flask, but you're certainly welcome to continue to ask questions, and I definitely would encourage that. But let's try and add in some new stuff to our template. So actually, in this environment where we're working in an HTML document that communicates with Flask, we can also use if statements. We can actually use if statements inside of HTML, which is pretty cool. So the way we do that is, instead of using a double curly brace, we use a single curly brace. So we write our if statement inside of this single curly brace, and actually these single curly braces get % signs attached to them too. And basically what this tag is telling Flask is that we can write some kind of logical statement inside of these curly braces and %. So Flask is going to look for these logical statements when it's going ahead and rendering our template. So let's write an if statement. So we already kind of are cheating, and we know that x equals 5. So let's write a really simple if statement based on that information. So we can say if x is greater than 4, which we kind of already know it is, right? And then when we add a new line, we can just put 2 spaces to indicate we're inside of this. Or actually, I don't even think we necessarily need to put 2 spaces, but you certainly can. You can say, and it's greater than 4. And then we can add some new logic underneath the if statement if we want. It's totally optional, where we can add an else statement. And with that else statement, we can say, and it's less than or equal to 4, because now if we change our x, the value of x, presumably we could easily end up in a case where x is less than or equal to 4. And different than normal Python programming, we actually need to end this logic, because Flask wants to search for when to stop doing logic and start rendering the file again normally. So we type end if to end that if statement. Kind of a it's kind of takes a little getting used to, because obviously in Python we have indentation, and indentation is telling the interpreter when to stop looking at the control statement, when to stop looking at the if statement. But in Flask, it's a little bit different, because we're kind of mixing HTML and our Python. So we just use end if to do it. So that's kind of a key thing to remember. Actually break this up a little bit so it's a little easier to read. Just like to put a couple spaces in between what we're doing. So let's actually run this now by refreshing our template. And if we scroll down, we now see it says the test variable passed from Python is 5, and it's greater than 4, which is absolutely true. And let's say we change to 3. If we do that, and now we reload, now it says it's 3 and it's less than or equal to 4, which is pretty cool. Actually, I guess 3 is not less than or equal to 4, so that's kind of a misleading statement, but I think you get the idea of what we're trying to code into here. There's another thing that we can do in terms of logic control, logical statements we can write into our HTML document that Flask will be able to understand. And that's for loops. So let's cover for loops now. These are just two examples. There are other examples of things you can add into Flask or into your HTML document. But a for loop is going to actually take on this exact same structure as the if statement did, where we put a parenthesis that's curly and a percent. But instead of writing if and then a conditional, we're going to write for I in range of 4. So it looks just like Python, right? In Python, we write for, and then we write some indexing variable, and then we say in, and then we specify a range over which to iterate. And that's exactly how we write it in this HTML. Yeah, Abhijit says elif is also applicable. That's absolutely true. So there are many different things you can do, not just if and for, but we're just going to stick to that for this workshop. And yeah, I think actually it's probably not necessary to put these indentation because, of course, we're not programming in Python, but I just like to do it for readability purposes. And I'm actually going to put this for loop as part of a unordered list. Actually, let's make an ordered list because we already made an unordered list, which is just bullet points. But an ordered list will actually show the numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. And what we can do is we can type into our list. We can say the first item is, or let's not say the first item. Let's say the item is, and then we'll put 2 curly parentheses to indicate we're going to substitute in a variable here, a variable value, which in this case will be our little iterator here, our indexing variable. And that's going to basically build many blocks of code. So in the first example with our unordered list, we actually had to manually write out all of these li tags, right? But in this for example, we're going to automatically be able to generate 4 different li statements or kind of li tagged items. And to end this for statement, similar to how we ended our if statement, we're just going to type end for inside of these curly braces and percents. So let's refresh our page and see what happened when we did that. So, we used to have this unordered list, and now we actually have an ordered list. It goes from 1 to 4, and it says this item is 0, 1, 2, 3. We can actually do some basic math in Flask too, if we want. We can just say I plus 1. Do that, then we get our items to match, which is pretty cool. So that's kind of a nice thing to look at. Okay. Let's move on to another topic. So we've now kind of explored our templating, and we're even going to get into some other topics that have more to do with dynamic rendering, right? Because even with the things we've explored so far, we're still ultimately fixing the value of x, right? Which is kind of the only thing we're passing into our template. We're fixing the value of x within our function, within our template function. So really, even though I said that we're going to talk about dynamic stuff now, and then I talked about this whole template thing, we haven't done anything that's truly dynamic. We're going to get to more dynamic things in the next couple of sections to this workshop. So the first thing we're going to do is learn about a basic kind of GET request. So let's actually use google.com for an example. So if I want to Google for Blahaj, and then I click search, you notice that when I Google for Blahaj, the contents of my address change dramatically. So it doesn't just say google.com anymore, even though I'm still on Google. Now it says I'm on google.com/search. And then there's this question mark Q equals Blahaj. and then this really long string of, complex characters and, things that I really don't understand at all. Maybe even some people who work at Google might not understand all the things that are involved in that. But basically, what's happening is when I do that search, some portion of the inputs that I gave to Google, which was the Blahaj string, are getting embedded in that URL. And now when I copy this URL, like let's say I close out of that tab, I can actually get my Blahaj search back by pasting in that old address. When I click enter, Google already kind of brings up my Blahaj search, which is super cool, right? In a sense, what Google is doing here is using some kind of GET request. It's getting this. I'm sure it's much more complicated than that because it's Google, but essentially, we're passing in this Blahaj string, and we're getting some information from Google based on that. So let's try and do that with our own Flask web app. And it's not going to be as advanced as what we can get from Google, where we get this nice page of results. But maybe we can create something that acts in a similar way with respect to this request. So to do that, I'm going to actually use another routing decorator. And this time I'm going to route to an endpoint called variable. And so in this variable endpoint, we're going to do something that kind of the name already betrays what we're going to do. We're going to have some variable input. And to specify that, in the argument to our routing decorator, I'm going to put another slash, another forward slash, and actually put in these hard braces. Putting in this little var here. And so these hard braces indicate that whatever comes in place of this placeholder var will be equal to some variable that we can actually use within our function. So now let's write our variable function. And if you recall from all of our previous examples, whenever we write a function, we never really pass in any parameters. But in the case of the variable function, I'm going to actually put in this var keyword. And, this var parameter. So now that we have this var parameter, we can actually use it within what we return to the Flask web app. So let's write a return statement, and we'll return a string, and we'll return the secret variable is, let's say the secret, it's not really a secret, is it? And actually, we'll get into that a little bit, is. Then I'm using these curly braces. This is actually a function that's built into Python that lets me put in the variable. So I'm saying the secret variable is, and then these curly braces are going to get replaced by var. We've kind of built now basically our first dynamic element into our web app, which is called variable. So now I'm going to run this again. It seems like maybe our REPL kind of collapsed a little bit there from last time, but let's navigate to the variable endpoint. Actually, right now, I wonder what happens. I think we just get not found because we're not actually working with the variable. We need to specify some specific var input. So let's do 5. And when we do 5, we get the secret variable is 5. So actually, our Flask web app took that var placeholder and read it from what we entered. It read 5, and then it passed that into the function. And now we can render the secret variable as 5, which is pretty cool. And I did put secret in quotation marks because actually this is not so secret, right? I had to send 5 over the internet. And so like you probably would not want to put a password into here. Like if your password was like, 6573 or something. you're sending it over the internet, which is probably not a great idea. And we'll talk a little bit more about um, the, the stuff about that. Have a good night, Adam. Adam comes to us from Europe, and I understand that in Europe it's kind of late, so good night. Here, the sun is still up here in Los Angeles. I think some of the folks who are joining us from even earlier time zones might just be morning time for you. So pretty cool. I actually have this little globe on my desk here I like to bring out for Local Hack Day because we get people from all over the globe. Even Antarctica, we have Antarctica time, Blahaj time. So this is my little globe for all the global hackers we have from LHD. Okay, so we've just built the first dynamic element to our Flask web app, and you should. It's a pretty cool thing to do. Unfortunately, it's not really accomplishing too much, right? It basically just takes the input from our web address and adds it into our website. But really, if you think about it, that's kind of the basic building block of every sort of GET request that's done on the internet, right? So we just did something that's really difficult to do without using some kind of framework like Flask. So that's kind of incredible in a way. We're going to expand on this idea of dynamically adding things, and I'm going to actually build, we're going to build a squalculator. Okay. So a squalculator. And a squalculator is an invention that I just made up. And a squalculator is something that will basically be a calculator. But the only thing the squalculator can do is square whatever number you put into it. So the squalculator is kind of a bad calculator, but it's useful for some things. If you want to know the square, you just type it into the squalculator. So let's build our squalculator. We're going to build it underneath our variable endpoint. We will do an app.route, and we'll route to squalculator. And our squalculator is not just going to work on this, simple get strategy where we basically just need to type in whatever number we want to input right into our web address. It's actually going to work on a more secure and user-based input. So like when we went to Google, right? I didn't actually type into Google like google.com/search ? Blahaj. I didn't type in any of that stuff. That would be really kind of confusing for the user. I actually just went to google.com and I put in the word Blahaj, and then I clicked the little search icon. And so Google did, they probably did a lot more than what I'm describing, but Google did a similar thing to what we're going to do now, which is called post request. And it took input from what I wrote down as the user in the fields on the website, and it incorporated that into what I then got as a result on the website. So like I put in the word Blahaj, and then I clicked search. And when I clicked the search button, things happened based on what I wrote in that input field, which is pretty cool. And so we want to enable not just this get, but also the post. So we'll write some methods keywords into our routing function. And this is a little complicated. You might not really be sure why we're writing values for a methods keyword. The reason we're doing that is because the route decorator is kind of working in two ways, where we can send things to the to the web app, and the web app can send us stuff back. So in all these previous cases, we're not really dealing with any inputs from the user. You could maybe argue that this variable endpoint is actually dealing with the user input because we're specifying the variable within the web address. But I would argue that, what I mean by a user input is something that gets put onto the website. So let's put in two methods. We want to not only allow for get, but also for post. Okay, so post is, like I said, it's going to be this way that we can use input variables from the website that the user put in into our web app, incorporate them in there. So let's get writing our function. So we got to write our function now. We'll write the calculator function. And you'll notice actually that in this function, I did not specify any parameters. And the reason for that is the parameters are not coming from the web address. We're going to build our squalculator, and our squalculator is going to actually have a little field inside of it in the HTML code that's going to take our variable in. So we don't need to put it as a parameter in our function. Pretty cool. We want to account for both cases here. We have a get and a post method. Remember that get is just retrieving information from the website. So let's write our get method first. So we want to ask the Flask web app whether the request was a get method or post method. So we'll write if flask.request.method equals get. And this is, I just kind of threw a lot of stuff at you there, right? You want to be like, wait a minute, slow down. Why are you saying flask.request.method? Well, if we look at how Replit understood this, when we type in our request, and then we type in method, it's using all of the functionality that's embedded within Flask. We didn't need to type out any complicated stuff. There's already this request object that we have in Flask. And so that's pretty cool that we already have all of this rich functionality where we can just kind of refer to a website request as flask.request. And then that has a method attribute within it. And so we just basically retrieved that. We did flask.request object, and then we just got the method attribute. And that's going to have one of many values. It could be get or post or put or delete or whatever. But we're just interested in get. So this get is going to be what we get when we just give it a web address and we're asking for it to return something basic. And what I'm going to do in this case is I'm just going to return flask.render template, and we'll call it squalculator.html. I haven't even built squalculator.html yet, but I'm just going to put it in there for now. Okay, so let's write our squalculator.html template now, because we're already referencing it in our render template method here. So why don't we go ahead and do that? We go into the templates folder and we add a file, and we'll call this file squalculator.html, just so that the name of the HTML file matches the argument that we pass in to this render template function. And in this squalculator.html file, I'm going to put a header here that says squalculator. Maybe I'll say welcome to the squalculator. And I'm going to write some HTML here that you might not really be familiar with, but that's okay, because it's not really the focus of the workshop. The focus is to learn about the Flask framework. But the tag that I'm going to use is called form tag. And so this is going to kind of take in some information from a form. So if you ever see a website that has fields like a name field, email, maybe you're subscribing to a mailing list, it might have one of these form tags attached to it. And inside of the form, we can add all kinds of inputs. So we like put an input tag in here, and we want to kind of give this input a type. So in the first case, I'm going to add a text field so that the so that the user can type out some stuff into a box, basically, where we'll take the number from the user that we want to square. And I'm even going to put a name on this input. I'm just going to call it input because that way I can actually figure out inside of the retrieval that we do in Flask where Flask should look for that post request value. So I'm just going to tell it to look at the input tag that's named input. That should be pretty good for our purposes. I'm also going to add another input here, and I'm going to give it a submit type, and this is a button. So if you ever see one of those gray square buttons on a website, that is what this is here. Input type equals submit. And so once the user hits that submit button, we want to basically send over whatever values might be in that text box. You might be wondering, like, how is this going to know that what we want it to do is a post request, right? It's just a form. It basically just exists on the internet, on this website, and doesn't really do much. Well, the way it's going to know is we actually are going to tell the form that we're doing a post method. And I'm also going to specify this action tag, which is going to tell it where to go after running the post request. But don't worry about that tag there. It's just basically not super important to the post request, to the actual action of that request. So now we're pretty much done with our squalculator. We can even try and run. So let's try and run here. And when I go to our website, we get our Hello Blahaj message. Yeah, so we can actually go to our squalculator. And when we go there, we did a GET request. That was a GET request that we just did. And if you recall from our code, that if we get a GET request, which we just gave one to the squalculator endpoint, it will return the squalculator HTML template. And in fact, here it is. Welcome to the squalculator. Pretty cool. So this is our squalculator, and we can type in 15 and click submit. It doesn't really work yet because we haven't implemented any code behind our post request. So, but we can do it. I mean, we can type in some numbers, and we get a type error, which is fine. But everything's good. We actually wouldn't get any errors if we didn't have a debug enabled for our run. But we're going to quickly fix these errors. It's not going to take us too long to fix these errors. So we want to actually add some functionality for our post request now. Because what I just did when I clicked that submit button, if you recall, we're doing a post request by sending over some user input across the web app. So let's add a second conditional statement here, which says if flask.request.method equals post. So now we may actually get some kind of request from the user, and it might not be as simple as a GET request. It might be a POST request, and that's going to require us to do some more handling. But before we get into the POST request, I wanted to reach out to you all on the comments section and see if any of you have any questions so far about what we've done in our Flask app. Any questions? Okay. Looks like some folks are saying it's all clear. That's good. I hope this is a helpful workshop. I feel like some of the reason why I chose to make this workshop really on the fundamentals of Flask is because I think sometimes folks get into using Flask and they're not really sure what's going on, because like some of these intro tutorials might be like build your first website, and it's kind of like a stock price monitor or something, and they really just get right into it. Uh, and so once you learn all these core concepts, then you can kind of branch out into those types of things, like maybe building a stock monitor website or some kind of map that displays cities around the world. It's all based on these fundamental technologies that exist in Flask. And the better you are acquainted with these ideas, the easier it's going to be for you to make that next jump to even using Flask without relying on a tutorial. So that's kind of the goal here, is for you to develop some independence in your knowledge of Flask. Okay, so yeah, now we're getting an error because we have some kind of I stopped coding basically. So we should start coding again, so Flask doesn't get too angry at us. So I'm going to actually now ask for the value of the field of that little text field that we made. I'm going to ask for that value within Flask, within this Python file. So let's write value, and this is going to be a variable where we actually declare it. We're going to instantiate this value variable, and its value, which is it's the value of value, kind of ridiculous, but it's going to be flask.request. So we're still looking at this request object. This is an object in Flask, right? Remember, without Flask, this is really gnarly to look at, this request. But with Flask, it's super simple to get an attribute from there. We have the form attribute, and we can even take an element from that form, which, if you'll recall, we named the text field within our form. We named that text field input. So that's why I put in these braces here. I put in the string input. Okay, I could just as easily have built this form and called this like Carl or something, or Jane or something, or Blahaj. And regardless of what I do, I can just retrieve that using Python. So now that we have the value variable well defined, this is always going to have a value, because there's always something we can retrieve from that input text field, even if it's an empty string. I'm going to actually go ahead and operate on this value variable. So let's redefine value as, well, let's actually call it the squared value. And we're going to cast this value variable into an integer. And that might not work, actually. There might be some error with doing that, and we'll get into that later. But I'm going to operate on this integer, this newly created integer called int value. And I'm going to just use the square operator. It's an arithmetic operator in Python. And I can just square this value. And now that I have squared value, I can actually pass that into our template. You might remember from our variable example, or actually from our template example, not from our variable example, excuse me, that you can actually put a value of a variable like x equals 3, and you can pass that into the template using an extra argument, an extra keyword argument, actually. And so let's do that right now. Let's return flask.render template calculator.html, and we need to specify a value. So we'll do let's do val equals, maybe we'll call it result. Let's call this result. equals squared value. And this result variable is just going to be the result of the squaring. And we're going to use it within our template. You might actually have caught maybe what I might call a mistake in the code, which is that in one case, we're using render template and we're passing in a variable to Squalculator. And in the next, we're not doing that for the get. And that's going to get tricky because we're going to want to use that variable inside of the code. So maybe we should add some kind of some kind of value for this result. And I'm actually going to give it a value of NA. Okay. And so my idea for this code is that we're going to kind of either pass in NA, which is a string. And if we do that, we know that we're only on the get. We only just got the data and we can write something underneath the Squalculator. Or we're not going to get the NA string. And if we don't get the NA string, we can assume that we got some kind of squared value from a user input. If that happened, then we should display it. We should just display the squared value in some way. So now we actually are kind of, basically done with our Python code for the Squalculator. So let's click run. And everything compiles just as we want it to. Isn't that great? It's great when things work. So that's pretty cool. All right. So now we have a little bit of work to do on our Squalculator in HTML because it's a static website, right? It doesn't actually render any dynamic elements. So let's go back to our Squalculator. And we'll write an if statement in our Squalculator. So this if statement is going to say in percents, it's going to say if, and then the conditional that we want. So we can say if our result is equal to NA. If that happens, then we want to print out, please enter a value into the Squalculator. Okay. That's pretty cool. And then if we get a result, so if our well, let's just write else, because anything else that result might be equal to is going to be like some number that we want. If we get some other result, then we can say the square of your number is, and we can write in double curly braces, result. So remember also, I almost forgot myself here, that you've got to write end if at the end of this if statement. Because again, in Flask, we don't, in this HTML file, we don't really have the same benefits that we get from indentation in Python. It's more there for readability than actual functionality. So let's actually look now at our Squalculator. And I just got the website, right? All I did was hit enter. And so if I hit enter, I got a GET request. And a GET request makes the result value NA. And so we get our please enter value into the Squalculator. Pretty cool. So let's actually try one of these values that I did before. Hopefully we don't get a type error this time. When I click submit, we get the square of your number is a huge number, like in the trillions or in the billions, not the trillions, almost the trillions. So that's pretty cool. I can even probably enter like a negative number in here. 625, huh? Okay. What if I enter some other value, like if I enter apple pie? Well, if I do that, we get a value error because, apple pie doesn't really correspond to any integer when we type it into um, our code. So actually, we could fix this if we wanted to. Maybe we should try that. So we can actually add some kind of what we would call an exception statement. So this is this step right here when we're casting our value into an integer, which means we're trying to convert whatever input the user wrote into the um, into the file. We're trying to convert that into a integer. We can write try and then put this inside the try statement, and we can write except value error, which will tell us that if on some, like for some reason we do get a value error when we try to do this casting, we can write squared value equals NA. Um, um, actually, maybe we'll try it. We could even do a third case, error. Let's say error. Or we get an error. So when we do this, we can update Squalculator so that we have a new condition here. Result equals error. You can say, please enter a valid number. Let's say a valid, a valid number. That's fine. Let's see if that works. And we hit run. So we'll get our Squalculator here. Yeah, I guess I should have written that differently. Actually, what I'm writing right now is new code. I've never really tried this error thing before, but elif should work fine for our purposes. Otherwise, if you notice, we actually need to hit end if after every if statement. So we could definitely write 2 if statements back to back, but we would need to put end if on each of them because we don't have the benefit of indentation in our Flask HTML file. Okay, so now we actually get a result. So let's try apple pie again. And it tells us, please enter a valid number. We didn't enter a valid number. If I try like some other random stuff, it still doesn't work. But if I try -256, it works out A-okay. All right. So we now have built our Squalculator. Congratulations to you all. These are actually all the activities that I had planned for us for today. But I do want to show you some other stuff. So like I did promise to show you this more advanced project that does also involve Flask. So let's go there now. I just sent the link over Twitch and YouTube, so you can go click on it. This is a Flask project that you can do on your own now with your knowledge of Flask, which is a little more involved. It's actually a hack planner. So it's kind of like a to-do list almost. You can use it at your next hackathon if you make it. It helps you keep track of your ideas for hacks and any tasks that you might want to do during the hackathon. And it actually incorporates a database as well. So all of the values that you add into your planner, like let's say you have an idea on a Monday, you're like, darn, I got to use that idea next weekend at the hackathon. You can add it into your hack planner and it gets stored in the MongoDB and it's ready for you waiting on the weekend. So this tutorial actually has some example code on GitHub. You can check out the app.py file, which has all of the different all the things we looked at today, like render template and request and redirect, but it's also going to include some more advanced concepts like connecting to MongoDB cluster, computing cluster. And it's going to actually have even some other stuff like remove elements. So pretty cool stuff. And yeah, so this is something you could look at if you're willing to take on some more advanced concepts. Someone says non-relational database MongoDB. That's right. So MongoDB is actually what you would call a NoSQL database. So it's running on a structure that's or an architecture that differs from a more traditional database. Yeah, but it's still, I would say, compared to SQL, it may even be slightly easier to learn. So I wouldn't let it. I wouldn't let that complicated non-relational database concept dissuade you from trying it out. And you're welcome, everybody, for the session. I hope that you did enjoy it. If you have any other questions, you can always reach out to me about Flask. You can check out the MLH community Discord, where we have like hackathons pretty much every weekend. And we have lots of mentors who are really experts in Flask, probably even more so than I am. In fact, definitely even more so than I am. And yeah, I would recommend checking those out if you have further questions about Flask. But hopefully this tutorial was able to give you some basic insights into Flask and really help you understand what's going on when you type in something like flask.request. What is that? Right? What actually is it? Flask.render template. What actually is that doing? What is a decorator? Right? So these are some of the basic fundamental concepts in Flask that's super important to learn before you move on to more advanced topics. All right, folks, I hope you have a really good morning, afternoon, evening, and I'm going to sign off now. I don't know if we have any other, I'm sure we have other events in LHD in Local Hack Day, but I'm curious which of, if there might be any more today. Does anybody know? So I want to kind of plug some of that stuff if we can. Seems like we have let me pull up the schedule for you all to check out. Looks like we have today, today is Thursday, we have some GeoGuessr at 10 p.m. Eastern, okay, this is going to be a little confusing for you because it's in Pacific time where I am. So I guess this would be 1 a.m. Eastern, GeoGuessr, in about 4.5 hours. So I definitely recommend checking that out. And if you haven't already checked into the Flask event, I definitely recommend checking in because it'll help you get points for your guild. And it also helps us keep track of like what people are interested in, and we can tailor our workshops to that as well. All right, folks, signing off now. Take care.